Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you from the capital of the world, Washington, D.C. We have a great guest for this hour. Joining us is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and host of the Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, airing on Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. We have Professor Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jamarl. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. I have to start it off here. What does it look like when countries, and I'm asking this question mechanically and socially, collapse? And let me give context. Joe Biden has been signaling or signaled through the Wall Street Journal that he's looking at austerity. He's saying that basically the cupboards are bare. And so, there's going to have to be austerity. This is one of his surrogates, part of the transition team. You've had two beauty pageants that, despite the world falling off of its axis, millions of people, in regards to getting thrown out of their homes, hundreds of thousands that are dead, even from the standpoint of the people that get ill and are going to have to get medical bills, or the retail stores that are closed, or the downstream effects, the world has fallen off its axis, and we're still in the middle of a COVID crisis. Now, from the standpoint of the politicians, they act as if this is not happening, and they give two beauty pageants that has America as an afterthought. I watched that and I thought to myself, this is going to collapse. There's no way this can keep going like this, where the political parties seem to just be utterly and completely detached from any notion of philosophical responsibility to the officers or to the people. Where does this end? And how does this look when empires fall? And does it look anything like what we're seeing now in our political system?
Well, I think you're pointing to something that psychologists have a word for. It's called denial. It's when you have a problem, whatever it is in your life, but instead of trying to get your head clear to understand the problem, to see where it comes from, to begin to try to develop a strategy for solving the problem, instead you're so upset by the reality of that problem that you decide instead not to see it, to pretend and to demand that the people around you join you in pretending it's not there. I'm reminded of what I once saw my, at that time, 2.5-year-old daughter do. We were walking down the street and a neighbor's dog came running out. No danger, just a dog wagging its tail. But my daughter was a little scared. And so she did a remarkable thing. She raised her hands, put them across her face so that they covered her eyes, and you could see her whole body relax. She was okay because the scary doggie was gone. Why? Because she put her hands in front of her eyes, and because she didn't see him anymore, well, then he wasn't there. You hope that a human being matures and figures out that the dog is still there if you cover your own eyes as a way of coping, and that it really won't work real well. I think that's where we're at. I think the beauty pageants, the Democrats and now the Republicans, are exactly that. They are pandering, they are furthering, they are serving denial. That they think that the way to get votes in this country at this time is not to face those problems, not to come up with serious solutions, which will be costly. That will scare people. They don't want to hear it, is what their thought is. And so we're going to join the chorus of denial. It's not there. We can talk about all the things that we always talk about in the happy comfort that this process of denial will get us votes, is what the people want, and therefore that's what we're going to do. And you're right. The only thing you can be sure of with such a display is that the problems will get worse because nothing remotely like a solution is coming.
With nothing coming, let me ask you this: with how does this track with other governments that have collapsed? Because I look at this as an economic system and a political system that are basically intertwined with one another. It's hard to talk about one without the other.
Yep.
And in other countries that have had those systems that have fallen apart, how has that basically looked? And does it look anything like what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I think it has looked this way. I'm not at all. I mean, if you wanted me to be blunt, but to be honest, I'm not surprised about this. I've seen these problems get worse and worse. I have seen effort after effort, either to pretend they're not there, or, and this has to be said, even worse, if you look at what was actually done over the last 6 months, since this crash of capitalism and this virus really hit us in March, you look at the period since then, this society has put a band aid on a cancer for the mass of people. Meanwhile, it has flooded the stock market with new money created by the Federal Reserve, given to the investors who bid each other up the price of stocks so their portfolios all look wonderful. These are acts of denial, acts of a kind of crazy notion that the people at the top can play these stock market games while the rest of the society falls apart. Let me tell you what the history suggests. There's the old joke. Rome was burning, but the emperor was playing the fiddle on the veranda, because for the emperor, for the people at the top, these are all minor inconveniences. If you can't live safely in your apartment, well, then you go to your country house. And if you can't run your business this way, well, you'll run it that way, or you won't run it for a while. This is the richest Congress in the history of the United States. The overwhelming majority of our political leaders are dependent on money from the people at the top and are themselves part of the people at the top. That's part of the intertwined politics and economics you just referred to. And for them, this is what the British used to call a rough patch. It's a period of difficulty that doesn't threaten their wealth, their dominance, their social position. It's an inconvenience. They're not facing eviction. They're not facing the loss of a job. They're not facing the implications of unemployment compensation being cut drastically. Those life changing realities are not their reality. And like my little daughter, they keep their hands firmly in front of their eyes, convinced that we'll get through this rough patch and they will be as dominant, if not more so, at the end than they were going in. And that's what they want from both political parties.
Let me is from the standpoint of the dollar and from the standpoint of the way that other nations regard the dollar, especially going through all of this. Is there some level of, let's say, either mitigation of either the effects of the dollar, or for that matter, let me ask this question a slightly different way. The unemployment numbers continue to go up, and the Trump administration was thinking that there was going to be this kind of V, uptick in America. It's like you cut the light on and all the jobs come back. Well, that's not going to happen. And so
Right.
you're seeing retail with with millions of people out of a job. I think like 30% of retail up in flames, with unemployment numbers still continuing to go up. Now, is Trump wrong? Are those unemployment numbers going to continue to go up, especially with the money that Congress, the meager sum that Congress was given to the various people in the country, being gone? That's eliminated now. And so
Well,
basically, you have people back to square one economically. Are those numbers for unemployment going to continue to rise?
at this point, you'd have to say yes. The only way you could stop that, well, there are two ways. One of which is the one they should have chosen right from the beginning, but they didn't. So I would guess the chances of their doing it now are next to zero. And the second one is the one they did a little bit, stopped doing, and could resume. Let me explain. The thing that could have been done and should have been done, and in other capitalist countries it was done, was never to allow this unemployment in the first place. And the way to do that was simple and could be adapted from American history because it's what we did in the 1930s. That was the last time we had unemployment on a scale, anything like what we have now. What did we do? Well, from 1934 till 1941, that's the overwhelming bulk of the Great Depression, the government hired people. That's right. You lost your job in the private sector, you got hired next week, next month by the government to do all kinds of socially useful things. You went to work as a government employee, you got paid properly as a government employee. That allowed you to continue shopping, that allowed you to cover your mortgage payments or your rent payments for your home, and to feel good about yourself. You're doing a job. And by the way, wonderful things were done by public employees in the 1930s. Let me give you a couple of examples. Some of the most beautiful parks in the West, those national parks that Americans go to and marvel at the natural beauty, etc., those were created by workers hired by the government after they lost their private sector jobs. Here's another example. Artists of all kinds, uh, singers, dancers, actors, sculptors, painters, all the arts. The government said if you lost your job in a theater, if you lost your job in a craft museum, we will hire you. And you're a skilled artist, and we're going to form artist teams, teams of actors, teams of singers, teams of painters, and send you all across the country offering classes and performances and whatever you do to masses of people who've never had access to culture like that. It was called the WPA, very, very famous program. And it was a wonderful way to keep people working and to do things socially more useful than anything they had done as private employees before. You turned unemployment from a disaster into a social asset. That could have been done now. It should have been done now. Some of the earliest ecological reclamation of land and of protecting the environment, those were done in the 1930s by government hired people who had gotten government jobs to do that kind of work instead of their private lost jobs from before. That's what should have been done in March. That's what could have been done all summer. Then you could have given people money, but you would have gotten back from them real services for all of us. Plus, they're not having to go through all of the psychological and personal trauma of unemployment when it lasts. Well,
Professor
that's
Wolff,
not going to
let's
happen.
cut in for one moment.
Sure.
We have to take a break. I'm going to bring you back, and we can get right back into this. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, Professor Wolff, Professor of Economics, Emeritus University of Massachusetts. We'll be back in a moment.
And we're back.
Welcome back.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Wolff. We've got Richard D. Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff, airing on the Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. By the way, quick promo for him too. On Twitter, you can follow him. Just go to Prof. Wolff. That's PROFWOLFF. Two F's there at the end. Professor Wolff, thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us. Quick question there on the end. You were talking, you were waxing poetic and praising the WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration, under Roosevelt, the various programs in the 30s. How would that work now, though? And specifically during a pandemic, how would it work to have people out? What would they be doing? I mean, we've talked about this with people before. I could see room for something like that. It's definitely echoing. We're in a financial crisis that seems to parallel, if not surpass, the legacy of the Great Depression. But so I could see a conversation around that. But we're also all stuck in our homes. What kind of work would you actually have people doing in these programs?
Well, I think the first thing, and it's a great question, and it's one that's asked often. Let me answer it this way. The first thing that we need, and that we should have done from the beginning, was to address exactly the problem of how we run a society when we have to protect ourselves against a virus like this. Or to say the same thing in simpler English. If you want, for example, your school system which you knew was ending one school year, March, April, it usually ends in May, and would resume this fall in a few weeks, as we know. One of the first things you would have used an army of unemployed people to do if the government hired them was to reconfigure and reorganize schools, keeping everybody 6 feet apart, keeping everybody in a mask, doing all the things that we've been doing anyway. You would have set people to work to create classrooms in which the desks were far enough apart, ways in which you could utilize all kinds of other buildings that sit empty or unused or underused in the community that could now be brought in so that they could house students appropriately distanced from one another with masks, etc. Here's another thing. You could have hired back teachers. You could have looked at the population as a population of people who could teach all kinds of things, even if they hadn't been teachers before. Hire them. Change the model of teaching for the duration of the pandemic. Instead of gathering large numbers of kids in a room, make it a tutorial. Make it a system in which one teacher is paired with, I don't know, 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 young people teaching during the day in a safe environment, carefully cleansed. And who does the cleaning? The unemployed. Who does the monitoring? The unemployed. Who reconfigures the spaces? The unemployed. All of this can be done. Let me remind you that during the last 6 months, buildings were built, things were done, workers were working. You could have had the unemployed alongside them, suitably, safely distanced, and all the rest, but doing all the things that we need to do. Let me put it yet another way. We are right now threatening, and that's the only honest word to use, threatening millions of workers with a choice. Either you go back to work, or we're cutting your unemployment, or not giving it to you, or we may take away the job forever. We may deny your eligibility for government program. Unbelievable. The government is threatening the mass of the working class when it has not, let me underscore this, it has not threatened the employers with having not spent the money to make the workplace safe. I mean, this is beyond words what history is going to remember about this period. Whether it's President Trump telling the meatpacking workers after the record corona infections they suffered that they had to go back to work in the meatpacking plants because we have a food need. Did he order the meatpacking companies to make the place safe? Not a word. Did he threaten them? Not at all. It was the workers who got the attack. What's going on here is a tremendous failure to undertake the kinds of steps that could have and should have been done. We could have reconfigured, for example, city streets on a temporary basis, using the tens of thousands, the millions of unemployed. Rerun the streets, make the streets pedestrian malls so that restaurants and stores can empty out, at least in the warm weather, so that we can have the space and the outdoorness that makes some degree of restaurant, some degree of store shopping safe for everybody. And the cleaning on a continuous basis. One last example. We still have not tested the vast majority of Americans for the virus. We don't know where it is exploding. We don't know what parts of the population need special attention so that all of us are not put at risk. Testing is what we needed, And millions of people could have been quickly hired by the government, given a proper training for a few weeks, and then sent out to do the first intelligent thing a pandemic needs, which is testing people, repeatedly testing people, making it possible, for example, for us to know that in a certain area or in a certain industry, having tested everybody in it, which takes time, but not if you have millions of people doing it, then you would know that this is safe here. It's kind of safe to go into a restaurant when it's set up this way. It's kind of safe in this area, and we can then figure out why is it the disease low in this area and higher in the other. We could have done on a proper scientific basis the kinds of work had we put the unemployed together. Would have paid them, but that we were doing anyway with the $600 and extra. So you could have done way better than what we did had you learned the lesson. And it's not only is it inferior to simply throw money at people rather than get them to do socially useful work. It's better for them, it's better for us. But now you see the horror of what Jamarl was asking me about before the break, that if they take away the $600, which they have now done, the extra for unemployed people, then what was keeping the retail sector going, all the statistics are there, is that monetary help to the unemployed. You take that away, you're giving another blow to the retail sector, and that's why you're beginning to see unemployment go up again. So if the government doesn't come in to fix that, yep, we're going to see rising unemployment. Once again, utterly unnecessary, utterly unjustifiable. I mean, you have not spent anywhere near as much money on the mass of the people as you have spent trillions for the people at the top who are speculating in the stock market with that money. And if you believe that the helping the people at the top will quote unquote trickle down to everybody else, it means you haven't been paying attention, because the trickling is only in the mind. It never actually gets to the bottom. So that it has always been people like me, and I'm not the only one, who say, why don't we change and have a policy that we call trickle up? You give the vast majority of the money to the people at the bottom, those who obviously need it most. Let them go out there and spend the extra money you're giving them, and that will buy the goods and services that generate the profits for those at the top. That way you're helping those who need it most, and you're believing in the trickle up effect of doing that, and that's going to help a lot more people than the trickle down nonsense that is the justification for what they've been doing.
Professor Wolff, we have about 3 minutes left. And as I listen to you, something comes into my mind in regards to a question, analogy. People push for $15 an hour minimum wage. Let's say fight for 15. And as they push for this, the owner gets annoyed with the workers and says, fine, you're all fired. And he puts in a robot for $14.95. Now, those workers are out of a job. Now, those workers were right to fight for that $15 an hour because they were fighting for a living wage. By the same token, the owner class, who looks at this as a competition, decided, I'm just going to put in a robot. And then gets to the point of automating the entirety of it, saving a nickel in the process. Now, as we move forward in time, workers have to fight this, right? I mean, this becomes one of those issues that workers, where the owner class has just one more weapon in their quiver or one more arrow to undermine any notion of organization and labor. How do we as workers mind that gap and fix that? Because it seems like the further in time you go, the weaker labor gets.
Well, the first thing you have to do is change your mentality, so you stop listening to or giving credence or believing in the nonsense that is said. It's as if we all went to some kind of mind-altering school and were told that whatever is best for profit is what is best for all of us. That's not true. It never was. And you ought to understand that a business can be run around the notion we do here what's best for the majority in this business, and that's the workers. Workers' wages, workers' income, workers' balance between work life and home life. Those are the things that matter most. not the bottom line. Remember, profit, the bottom line, you know who gets it? The owners, the top executives. Of course, they want us all to think that what's good for profit is good for all of us, but it never was. What's good for profit is good for them, not for us. We could have run businesses around a completely different mentality. And let me give you an example that Americans sometimes seem to grasp. We don't run the military in this country around the notion of what's most profitable. We run the military around the notion, here's what our dangers are, here's what we need military security for, and that's what we're going to do. We don't ask the tank group to become profitable in their tanks, or the foot soldiers, or the airplane pilots. We train them to do a task that has to do with the problem they're supposed to solve. Hey, you know what work is? Work is an activity that produces the goods and services that the vast majority, working people, need to have a decent life. That's what work is for, not for the profits that go to a small minority. If American workers had that in their heads, understood that, they would never allow what is done in American workplaces today to continue to go on.
We've sadly got to cut it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That was the voice of Professor Richard D. Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff. Airs on the Democracy at Work channel on YouTube. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas.